Okay, gang. The final video for this week is on this business of materiality, straight on. And the reading is a tiny little short piece that I wrote a few years ago, 2015, on as just a little part of a journal. It's things called forums that they do every once in a while in journals, where they devote just a chunk of the total pages of the journal to a specific issue, theme, and then people write short little statement pieces on this theme. And the theme of this forum was rhetorics and foodways, that I put together with a couple of colleagues of mine, and my own little contribution is a little piece called Morality M/Orality. So obviously orality is thinking about the tradition of rhetoric that goes back to the beginnings, oratory. In its original formulation, rhetoric was about oration, right? About standing in front of people and speaking aloud. Obviously it's changed a lot, as we've seen. And then there's this other question of morality, which gets at issues of evaluation, standards, judgments, values, and so on. So it's trying to think about these kind of two traditions, that kind of Aristotelian, Ciceronian tradition, where rhetoric is thought about as, the canons and invention and eloquence and delivery and style and so on. But then, this other kind of 20th century set of concerns over questions about ideology, morality, judgment, and sort of trying to think about our rhetorical influences and choices and so on in a more reflexive way. Don't forget, when we go back to Edwin Black's piece, The Second Persona, at the beginning of that, he's talking about this, the sort of the moral job of the critic. He was saying that the critic's function is to essentially kind of make moral appraisals of rhetorical action in the day that we happen to find ourselves. Rhetorical speech, rhetorical performances, events, and so on. The critic's job is to kind of understand it, make sense of it, and then apply some sense of discernment, some sense of evaluation, some sense of this is good, bad, right, wrong, dangerous, futile, whatever, right? So that's the idea of the title there, is to think about this tradition of orality, but also adding this more kind of contemporary concern over questions of ethics and aesthetics. And so that gets to this question of food, and more specifically taste, something that I've been really interested in writing about now for a few years, this question of taste. And the reason I'm fascinated with taste is because it gets at so many other concerns within rhetoric. Now, taste is not something that most rhetorical theorists are terribly interested in these days. In terms of the theory of taste, you'll find little blips in the history of rhetorical theory. In the ancient context, there was a few important works. Longinus on the Sublime is important. But by and large, it was the 18th century, 17th and the 18th century, the modern era, is when guys like David Hume and Immanuel Kant, and some like straight up rhetorical theory types like Hugh Blair, George Campbell to a certain extent, Lamy, like a lot of the guys who were writing about rhetoric in that time were also writing about taste. And taste had a very specific kind of social, cultural kind of presence and grip at the time. And basically amounted to, like, taste was this kind of faculty of perception, aesthetic perception, right? So when you think of, oftentimes when you hear taste, you think of, oh, he has good taste. It's like, oh, he appreciates good art, right? Or he can tell the difference between Mozart and Beethoven, right? Or he knows, the difference between the Impressionists and the Expressionists or whatever, because you have taste. That's a very kind of modern idea of taste, which is this idea of kind of cultivating and enhancing and improving one's aesthetic refinement. So in the 18th century, to talk about taste was already to be talking with the kind of the social cultural elite about culture, art, manners, civility, and so on, fashion. So taste was something that mostly belonged to like the elite, right? The privileged classes of society. And then in the 19th century, we had these mass democratic movements, and they continue through the 20th century. And so, to the extent, my argument is that to the extent that we don't theorize taste or talk so much about taste in the academic sense very much anymore, it's largely because it has this stench of elitism. To talk about taste is to talk about, Mercedes Benz's and, la-di-da stuff versus, McDonald's or Burger King or, so there's this sort of elitism that comes with attitudes about taste theory, right? So the move I'm trying to make is to materialize taste and to think about taste in the context of the total human, right? So in the 18th century, to think about taste was more to think about, again, this is Descartes, right? To think about cognition, to think about the brain, to think about the mind, to think about taste as a kind of a faculty of the imagination and judgment and reason and so on. But they mostly ignored body. They mostly ignored taste as in this taste, right? So I'm trying to kind of get back to thinking about taste in that total sense. And so let's just open this up here. In the very first paragraph, it says, by taste I refer to the habituated expression of individual preferences as a combination of both aesthetic judgment, that's up here, and corporal longing, that's embodiment, right? Corporal longing is like, I have a craving, It's a more kind of, it's trying to get a more complete picture of this faculty of choosing, essentially. Choosing this, choosing that. Driven by preferences, driven by judgments, driven by desires, driven by aesthetic and ethical senses of what's good, what's right, what's bad, what's wrong, ugly, and so on. This whole kind of spectrum of considerations, and that's my interest in taste, because in terms of my research, I consider myself to be a neo-materialist, or a materialist. I care very much about the kind of the hard stuff and how our movements and choices and our identities, our sense of self, our sense of community, and so on is so much like determined and shaped by just the kind of the realities of where we find ourselves and what we find ourselves interacting with or not, right? And so materiality is the theme here of this week's reading. It's materiality, and taste is a way, or at least this sort of this way to talk about taste is meant to get at the question of materiality. When I'm talking about taste, I'm talking about food largely, and so it's about consumption. And then you get into these questions about like, all right, well, what are you consuming? Where is it coming from? What's in it? How much do you know about what's in it? How much do you know about why you're choosing these things? And how much do you know about how it's affecting your body and how it's affecting your community's bodies or the national public health situation, right? So to talk about food is already to be deeply invested in materiality. And then to think about taste, at least is my way to kind of intersect questions about materiality with questions about subjectivity, right? About perceptions, judgments, attitudes, values, and so on. So I think of taste as like being the knot around which so many of these really important forces and considerations kind of come together. Which is, hence that opening paragraph, the opening sentence, right, is that taste is something that happens between subjects, that's humans, and objects like animals or tractors or whatever. Bodies and institutions, so it's humans, it's individuals, it's institutions like whatever, banks, hospitals, schools, universities, corporations, the workplace, and so on. At the heart of politics of consumption, so thinking about why it is we choose the things we choose and don't choose other things. Questions about access and power and winners and losers and so on. Buried within the relations between affects and memories, we've talked about affects in the sensation stuff. That's the physical stuff. Memories being more about internal subjective recall. Desires, habits, choices, chances, so and on and on and on, right? So taste intersects with so many other important historical considerations, historical forces, and so on, that to me it feels like a really great way to get at the most additional kinds of processes and activities and forces and so on, right? So the idea of this little piece here is to try to think about taste, right? Taste as both literally, ingesting food and what that all means, but also questions about sort of cognitive senses of taste in terms of, perception, appreciation, attitude, judgment, right? How it is that we make decisions about good and bad, right? So the case of Detroit becomes quite interesting, and so I would really encourage you to look specifically at that last little chunk on the curious case of Detroit, which in terms of materiality, in terms of hard physical reality, Detroit's one of the saddest cities in the country. Was once this thriving mecca of industrial success and progress with the automotive industry, and now is basically just a wasteland, right? And it's trying so hard to get back on its feet, and so economically, socially, aesthetically, just the look of the place and so on, it all kind of swirls around this activity of urban farming that I'm tracking. And so the argument here is that urban farming and all these really interesting developments that are happening in these communal efforts that are swirling around the production, the local production of food within the limits of the city of Detroit. This is really a story about taste. It's about a community, of people saying, we're basically living in a food desert. All that's surrounding us is convenience stores and fast food, and we're sick and tired of this, this junk food, this processed crap. We want to take some authorship over our future, and so hence these gardens and these farms and these plots, and it's this beautiful, inspiring kind of arrangement of urban agricultural production. And that's all materiality. And so now this, rhetoric, where's rhetoric here? So we would seem to have strayed quite far from, Aristotle and Cicero and so on, but through that notion of taste, this idea of judgment, this idea of aesthetic appreciation, but also corporal, physical longing, right? So embedded in this idea is a kind of rejection of this Cartesian dualism where you got sort of the mind over here and you got the body over here, and they're mostly separate, right? Taste brings everything together, right? So it's a way of kind of getting at social processes that are driven by both our sense of what is right and good and just. That's the aesthetic, judgmental part, the cognitive part, but also that the hugely powerful influence that food and the systems around food have on our bodies, our sense of what is, tasty, delicious, gross, preferred, right? And then how sort of the question of value and cost plays into all that is really, it's tricky stuff, right? But it's important. So I guess the last thing I'd maybe just sort of draw attention to is the very last paragraph on 226 there. It sort of brings everything together in terms of the stakes and how this is about materiality. So the taste-driven phenomenon captures the totality of life in Detroit today. This is what the relations between deliciousness and democracy look like. So that's sort of like the relation between taste and politics. All of what matters most has been affected in Detroit. Spatial aesthetics, the look and feel of the city, proximity to resources, right? So instead of being in food deserts, we now have an abundance of healthy produce and delicious food. Quality of diet and health, obviously, the question of self-determination and communal agency. I would challenge you to go, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, do go watch that documentary called Urban Roots. and prepare to have your mind blown at this inspiring story of this community of people who are really struggling, coming together and realizing their rhetorical agency, as my colleague Philip Sherhart would say. He was just in my office a moment ago, and he likes this phrase, rhetorical agency. It's a good phrase, right? So exercising rhetorical agency by creating a garden, by getting down on your hands and knees and creating food that improves your life and improves your community, improves your visual landscape, right? And gives you a sense of purpose and connectedness and so on. So there's a lot going on here, right? Self-determination, communal agency, general education, physical labor, neighborliness, mental health. In that documentary, they show how folks who have, what do they call it, community service to do, or they've struggled, they've ended up in jail or whatever. Let's get these people in the garden, right? Let's use this as an opportunity to heal and train and connect and so on. So it's an interesting Detroit's an interesting case of how the materiality of a social landscape, economic, cultural, political, and so on, all can revolve around really important considerations about taste, about choice, judgment, a sense of values, and so on. And so I track all that stuff through our food habits and production and consumption and where things come from and what we do with them and the value that we add to things and the value that we get from things. So the materiality question is, it was Burke who sort of got the ball rolling by moving rhetoric from a concern over just, deliberate persuasion and even just a concern with language as such to a much broader concern over the symbolic realm of our lives. Although he was very interested in the unconscious, which meant that he was interested in sort of bodily drives and bodily impulses. And as we move forward away from Burke, we see how rhetoric continues to extend beyond and beyond and beyond, right? So now we've moved away from language, we've moved away from the symbolic, and we've gone so far as to go, to think about materiality, right? So think about a garden as a place of rhetorical value. I know it seems like it's, we're very, very far away from, political oratory in the ancient times, but the concern here is over where do we go if we want to understand what matters to communities, what matters to civic life, what matters in terms of our political belonging and our sense of connectedness. Speech still matters, oratory still matters, but my sights head in the direction of food systems, public health, what things cost, where they come from, what they're made of, the effects on landscapes and landfills and animals and communities. There's so much going on here. So that's the materiality. For me, rhetoric is about influence and it's about change, right? So if you're concerned about what is influencing us, ourselves, our bodies, and so on a daily basis, then you should also be concerned about questions of how to change that. So I'm tracking, where's the change? Where's the exciting change? And I'm seeing really interesting things happening at the realm of food. And so taste for me becomes a way to kind of map all that stuff. So there you go. That's our week on space, materiality, affect, sensation. It was a week of the physical things. The spaces that we surround ourselves, that we find ourselves surrounded by, and that we enter into and exit, the sensations that we experience and encounter along the way in our travels, and then materiality itself, and what's around us, what are we connected to, what's available, what's nearby. Food is a great way to think about all that kind of stuff. So there you go for week 4, and as always, ask me those questions. Come on by the office. Would love to hear from you, and hope all's well.